There's a version of Cody Garbrandt that nobody could beat. A version so sharp, so explosive, so technically complete that one of the sharpest minds in MMA history had absolutely nothing for him. For one night, Cody Garbrandt was untouchable. The problem is, that night was almost a decade ago, and it never came back. His story isn't just about talent wasted. It's about what happens when the sport finds you before you're ready for it, and what it looks like when a man's greatest strength slowly becomes the thing that destroys him. Cody grew up hard. He came from Uricksville, Ohio, a small Rust Belt town where options were limited and the streets weren't exactly forgiving. He lost people close to him young, dealt with poverty, and found fighting not as a hobby but as a lifeline. By the time he discovered combat sports, it wasn't just something he was good at, it was the only thing that made sense to him. That kind of desperation either breaks a fighter or makes them dangerous. For Cody, for a while, it made him genuinely terrifying. He built his name in the California regional MMA scene before the UFC ever came calling, knocking opponents out with the kind of hand speed that made coaches do a double take. He wasn't just powerful, he was fast, technically sound for his age, and carried himself like someone who had nothing to lose. When the UFC signed him in 2015, the expectation was that he was maybe a year or two away from sniffing a title shot. He got there in less than one. In his first year with the organization, Cody went 5-0, stopping for opponents in the first round alone. Ranked fighters were falling in front of him like they'd never seen anyone move like that before. And honestly, at 135 pounds, maybe they hadn't. The title shot that came next felt both inevitable and premature at the same time. Dominic Cruz was everything Cody wasn't. Patient, technical, emotionally cold, a chess player in a sport full of checkers. Guys, Cruz had been dismantling Team Alpha male fighters for years. Uriah Faber, TJ Dillashaw, Ian McCall. They'd all come, and they'd all fallen short. And now here was another one, a kid with fast hands and a short fuse, walking in like he was going to be the one to finally end the dynasty. Most people weren't buying it. Cruz made sure to lean into that narrative hard. He picked at Cody publicly, questioned his maturity, called him insecure, and made it clear he thought the whole tough guy persona was just a front. The idea was simple: get Cody so angry before the fight that he'd walk in emotionally compromised, throwing his game plan out the window the moment things got uncomfortable. It had worked on others before. There was every reason to believe it would work again. What happened, instead, left the combat sports world completely speechless. Cody Garbrandt walked into that cage, composed. Not just reasonably composed, surgically composed. He moved with confidence, picked his shots, used his footwork, and dismantled Dominic Cruz in a way that nobody had ever managed before. He outstruck him, outwrestled him, and controlled the fight from start to finish. The man who built his entire career on making opponents miss and making them pay couldn't find Cody with anything significant for 5 full rounds. When the decision came back unanimous, it wasn't even a conversation. Experts who had spent years watching Cruz beat every challenger Team Alpha male threw at him were openly saying they'd never seen a 135-pounder look that good. At just 24 years old, Cody Garbrandt was the UFC Bantamweight champion of the world, and it genuinely looked like the start of something historic. But that was the peak, and what followed would be one of the most painful and confusing falls the sport has ever seen. The first title defense came with a storyline that was almost too personal to process. TJ Dillashaw, Cody's former teammate, former training partner, the man who had sparred with him hundreds of times and knew every habit in his game, was walking in to take the belt. The fallout from TJ leaving Team Alpha Male had been messy and public. Dillashaw had followed coach Dwayne Ludwig to Colorado, accepted money from a new gym, and in the eyes of the team, especially Cody, betrayed everything they'd built together. Whether that reading of events was fair or not didn't matter. To Cody, it was a deep personal wound, and that wound was about to share an octagon with him. The difference in how both men carried themselves heading into that fight told you everything. TJ was calm, measured, almost dismissive. He treated the whole betrayal narrative as noise, a career move that made sense for him financially and professionally. Nothing more and nothing less. Cody, on the other hand, looked ready to explode every time the two were in the same room. The trash talk was relentless. The body language was volcanic, and behind every word he said you could feel something dangerously close to rage. The first round unfolded like a confirmation of every concern. Cody looked sharp early, built momentum, and by the end of round 1 had Dillashaw in serious trouble. A few more seconds and the fight might have been over, but TJ survived, and when he came back out for the second round, something had shifted. He'd made adjustments, settled his breathing, and started to exploit the very thing that had always been lurking underneath Cody's brilliance: the impulse to force the finish, to abandon patience, to take a shot in order to land one. TJ caught him clean, and the belt changed hands just like that. The rematch went almost exactly the same way. Different night, same story. Cody came in emotional, chased the knockout, and paid for it when TJ made him pay. 2 fights, 2 losses, and a pattern that was becoming impossible to ignore. When Garbrandt got touched, something switched off in his brain. The technical boxer disappeared, and what showed up instead was a flat-footed brawler swinging for the fences, desperate to end the night with one shot, completely open to counters in the process. It wasn't just bad luck, it was a habit, and habits that deep don't just go away. The Pedro Munoz fight made that clearer than anything. Cody was winning, genuinely winning, looking sharp in the early exchanges until an accidental headbutt caught him and something in his brain just snapped. He saw red, he started throwing wild, abandoned every principle that made his boxing dangerous, and walked into a shot that put him down. In his own words, he knew what happened. He knew in the moment. He just couldn't stop himself. That inability to stop himself became the defining feature of his career from that point forward. And opponents started noticing. Fight camps began building entire strategies around it. Get under his skin, make him emotional, watch him dismantle his own game plan from the inside out. It worked more often than not. What made it so frustrating to watch was that the talent was always there. Cody Garbrandt never lost his physical gifts. The hand speed was still elite. The power never faded. Even in his losses, there were moments, flashes, where you could see the fighter who took Dominic Cruz apart. But those moments kept getting shorter and shorter, swallowed up by the version of Cody who wanted to end every fight in a phone booth, trading with guys who had the chin and the composure to outlast him. And here's where the third piece of the puzzle comes in, the one that made everything else so much more costly. Cody Garbrandt never had a great chin. The evidence dates back to 2012, an amateur fight where he was stopped cold and went out flat on his back. You can see it in the way he absorbed shots throughout his career, not rolling with them, not slipping them, but catching them clean, full force, directly on the button. A fighter who chooses to stand and trade can sometimes survive on a granite jaw. Cody was choosing to trade without that insurance policy, and the bills kept coming due. 7 losses in 10 fights since winning the belt, 4 of those ending by knockout or TKO in the first or second round. The numbers don't lie. But to put it all on Cody personally would miss something important about how this story unfolded. After the Cruz fight, the UFC saw a 24-year-old undefeated champion with the looks, the personality, and the highlight reel to become the next crossover star. They moved fast. Commercials, celebrity endorsements, reported investments of around $6 million in marketing before his first title defense. The machine was already in motion, pushing him toward a version of stardom that McGregor had made look manageable, but that very few people are actually built to handle. Cody went from borrowing money from his adopted father to cover dinner before the Cruz fight to being positioned as the new face of an entire sport. All in the span of a few months. There was no slow build, no adjustment period, no time to let the lessons of winning sink in before the next challenge arrived. He was 24. He was world champion. And by his own admission, at that point in time, nobody could tell him anything. That's not a character flaw. That's just what happens when success arrives faster than wisdom. The very thing that made him dangerous, that raw, unfiltered, take no prisoners mentality, was also the thing the sport needed to sand down before the bright lights hit. And there was never any time for that sanding to happen. The pressure, the expectations, the personal stakes of the Dillashaw fight all collided at once. And the cracks that had always been there just widened under the weight. What remains is one of the great what-ifs in combat sports history, because the ceiling on Cody Garbrandt was genuinely extraordinary. On the right night, against the right opponent, with the right emotional stake, there may have been no better 135-pounder on the planet. He proved that once, completely and undeniably, in front of the whole world. The tragedy isn't that he failed to become great. He was great. The tragedy is that greatness lasted one night, and the decade that followed has been spent chasing a version of himself that showed up once, burned everything in sight, and never fully came back. There are fighters who build legacies through consistency, and then there are fighters who burn so intensely in a single moment that the memory of it outlasts everything that came after. Cody Garbrandt is the second kind, and depending on how you look at it, that might be the saddest thing about him or the most remarkable. The brightest stars don't always burn the longest, but nobody who was watching that night in December 2016 will ever forget what it looked like when Cody Garbrandt was on fire.